The world was set on fire between 1939 and 1945. Nations clashed. Cities burned. Ordinary men became legends, and entire empires rose and fell in the shadow of war. This is WWII Chronicles. Here, we dive deep into the stories behind the battles, the moments of triumph, the tragedies of loss, and the iron wills that shaped history. From the skies over Europe to the vast oceans of the Pacific, every tale carries echoes of courage, sacrifice, and the cost of arrogance. No politics, no lectures, just raw, cinematic storytelling that brings World War II to life, as if you were there hearing the roar of engines, feeling the thunder of guns, and standing on the edge of history itself. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the war that changed the world, one story at a time. This is the WWII Chronicles, where history comes alive. Smoke curled through the air of Tokyo's Grand Naval Headquarters. Maps stretched across polished tables. Red pins marked American bases, blue lines traced Japanese advances. The room pulsed with confidence. Admirals, dressed in crisp uniforms, spoke with the certainty of men who believed the ocean itself belonged to them. Their voices were calm but sharp, like steel cutting silk. America, one smirked, lifting his cigarette to the ceiling. A nation of traders. Their carriers? Toys. Floating coffins. The others laughed. Behind their laughter was conviction, not bravado. For decades, Japan had honed its fleet into a blade sharper than any in the Pacific. Battleships with gleaming guns, carriers that seemed untouchable, squadrons of pilots drilled to perfection. In their eyes, America was clumsy, untested, soft. The rising sun flew proudly from warships that cut across the Pacific like predators. Every officer aboard knew the same story: Japan had been underestimated before. Now, they were the empire of the ocean. And as America stumbled through the Great Depression, Japan built, ship by ship, plane by plane. Their admirals measured strength not just in steel, but in spirit. Bushido. Discipline. These, they believed, were the weapons the Americans lacked. In smoky bars and strategy rooms alike, American carriers became the butt of jokes. Too few. Too fragile. A single torpedo, and the beast is gone, one captain boasted. They drank to the thought of sinking them in waves, of crushing American pride before it could even rise. What none of them said, what none of them believed, was that America's shipyards could awaken like a sleeping giant. To Japanese eyes, America's weakness was permanent. Their faith in battleships, in speed and surprise, made them blind. Aboard Japan's gleaming flagships, the arrogance was palpable. Captains stood on decks polished like glass, gazing over squadrons of Zero fighters, convinced they had already secured the century. When they spoke of war with America, they spoke of inevitability. A brief conflict. A decisive strike. Then, a humbled United States would retreat across the Pacific. But history would remember their laughter differently. It was not the sound of strength. It was the sound before a fall. Because as their admirals mocked, as they raised glasses in overconfidence, the United States, wounded, humiliated, but not broken, was already stirring. Their words of scorn would echo in silence years later. In war-torn seas. In burning wreckage. In the shadows of carriers they swore could never be built. For now, though, Japan's admiral smiled. They believed the ocean was theirs. And with every arrogant word, they unknowingly wrote the opening lines of their own undoing. December 7, 1941. The morning sun broke over Pearl Harbor like any other Sunday. Sailors polished decks. Flags rippled gently in the Hawaiian breeze. Families on shore prepared for church. Then came the roar. A distant hum at first. Then thunder. Japanese aircraft, wave after wave, screamed from the skies. Bombs tore through steel. Torpedoes carved the harbor's waters into fire. Battleships, once thought invincible, were split open like tin. Columns of smoke twisted upward, black scars against the blue. The pride of America's Pacific Fleet lay burning. The USS Arizona, shattered. The Oklahoma, rolled to its side. Men trapped below decks pounded on steel walls until the ocean silenced them. In just 2 hours, the illusion of American security was gone. Newspapers screamed the next morning. Infamy. Disaster. Fleet crippled. Across the nation, families clutched headlines with trembling hands. Radios carried voices that quivered with shock. Sons, brothers, fathers, gone in an instant. In Tokyo, glasses clinked. Admirals bowed in celebration. The rising sun had struck its boldest blow. To Japan, America was now a fleetless giant, bleeding and humiliated. And in Washington, the mood was grief wrapped in rage. President Roosevelt's voice thundered through Congress, a date which will live in infamy. Behind those words, anger boiled into resolve. Yet in the Pacific, the picture was grim. The great American battleships, the symbols of power, lay twisted on the seafloor. Only a handful of carriers, scattered and outnumbered, survived by chance. They became the last fragile shield standing between Japan and complete domination. Across the nation, despair collided with determination. Families hung gold stars in windows. Factories once silent during the Depression came alive with steel and fire. Men lined up at recruiting stations. Women stepped into workshops, riveters and welders replacing silence with the thunder of machines. But in December of 1941, that resolve was still raw. America was in mourning. Soldiers were buried in foreign soil. Children whispered questions their parents could not answer. Would Japan invade the mainland? Would the Pacific be lost forever? Meanwhile, Japan's commanders exhaled with satisfaction. They had dealt the blow they dreamed of. Their diaries carried words of triumph. America will not recover. Their pilots toasted victory. Their admirals gazed at maps where American outposts shrank like candle flames in the wind. They did not see what was coming. Because under the ashes of Pearl Harbor, something stirred. A steel resolve, slow, heavy, relentless. For every ship that burned, Americans vowed to build 2. For every sailor lost, 10 recruits would take his place. Factories that once made cars turned to bombers. Assembly lines built wings and engines day and night. The nation was no longer a sleeping giant. It was a wounded giant. And a wounded giant does not surrender. Still, in those first dark months, the Pacific belonged to Japan. Carriers like the Akagi and Kaga ruled the seas. Their planes swept across islands and atolls, planting flags in waters that once seemed distant dreams. America's carriers, too few and too fragile, stalked cautiously in the shadows. Pearl Harbor was not the end. It was the beginning. The fire that would forge something the Japanese never imagined. A fleet larger, faster, deadlier than the world had ever seen. But in December of 1941, America knew only loss. The smoke still lingered. The graves were still fresh. And the Pacific, for now, belonged to the rising sun. June 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The Pacific trembled under the weight of Japan's advance. Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore. One after another, Allied strongholds fell. The rising sun stretched across half the ocean. And now, Japan's admirals turned their gaze toward Midway, a tiny atoll, but a stepping stone to Hawaii itself. If Midway fell, the heart of America's Pacific defense would lie exposed. The Japanese came confident, certain. Their plan was flawless on paper. A massive fleet, 4 carriers, battleships, cruisers, would smash America's last defenders. Then the Pacific would truly belong to the empire. But war is never flawless. Unknown to Japan, American codebreakers had cracked their messages. In hidden rooms in Pearl Harbor, men bent over typewriters and radios, deciphering fragments. AF, the code word for Midway, revealed Japan's plan. The trap they had set was now turned against them. And so, 3 American carriers steamed toward destiny: the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the battered survivor of Pearl Harbor, the USS Yorktown. Outnumbered, outgunned. Their decks carried planes, but also something more. The weight of a nation. The morning of June 4th broke with silence over Midway's waters. Then, a scout plane spotted a shadow on the horizon. Japan's carriers. Engines roared. Squadrons launched. The sky filled with wings. American pilots rose to meet them. But many flew obsolete planes, slower, weaker, fragile against the nimble Zero fighters. Torpedo bombers went first. One by one, they dove low over the waves, releasing torpedoes at point-blank range. One by one, they were torn apart. Machine gun fire ripped through cockpits. Explosions lit the ocean. Entire squadrons were annihilated. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. Carrier after carrier reported silence. No hits. Dozens of men gone. The ocean swallowed their sacrifice. But that sacrifice bought time. High above, unseen by Japanese eyes, American dive bombers circled. Their fuel running low. Pilots desperate, scanning endless water. Then, a break in the clouds. Below them, the enemy fleet. For carriers, decks crowded with fueled planes and bombs, vulnerable in a fleeting moment of chaos. The order came, attack. From the sky they fell. Stuka-like screams as dauntless dive bombers plunged, sun glinting off wings. The ocean rushed upward. Then, release. Bombs tumbled, whistling death. Explosions ripped through Japanese decks. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu. In minutes, 3 of Japan's proud carriers were turned into infernos. Fireballs engulfed planes still waiting to launch. Crews leapt into flames or water. Admirals who once laughed at American carriers now stared at the unimaginable. By day's end, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, was also ablaze. Japan's strike force, its elite, its pride, lay in ruins. Midway had been a gamble. A roll of dice on the open sea. And Japan had lost everything it could not replace. For America, the cost was heavy. The Yorktown sank beneath the waves, her men abandoning ship as fires consumed her. Dozens of pilots never returned. But in exchange, the tide had turned. Mockery gave way to unease. Japan's admirals no longer spoke with laughter. Their diaries carried words like shock and disbelief. In the silence of burned decks, they realized the truth. America's carriers were not toys. They were the new kings of the Pacific. Midway was more than a battle. It was the shattering of illusion. For Japan, the ocean no longer promised victory. For America, the Pacific no longer seemed impossible. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, from the smoke of Midway, a new war began, one not of battleships and pride, but of carriers. Floating airfields. Steel decks stretching across the horizon. And as Japan buried its 4 shattered giants, America was already laying keels for dozens more. The last dice roll had been cast. And the game had changed forever. Midway was a miracle, but miracles alone do not win wars. Behind the heroism of pilots and the gamble of fate, another force was stirring. Not on the ocean, but in the factories. Not in cockpits, but on assembly lines. The United States, humiliated at Pearl Harbor, bloodied in the Pacific, now turned its fury into steel. In shipyards stretching from Brooklyn to San Francisco, sparks flew like fireworks. Steel plates rang under hammers. Rivets clanged in deafening rhythm. The smell of oil, sweat, and hot metal filled the air. Men who once built cars now forged hulls. Women who once sewed dresses now stitched canvas for wings. Entire towns were swallowed by the war effort. Trains roared across the continent, loaded with timber, oil, steel, and men in hard hats ready to bend it all into ships. The scale was staggering. Japan could replace almost nothing it had lost at Midway. Each carrier represented years of labor, scarce resources, and a fragile industrial base already stretched thin by its empire's hunger. But America was different. For every ship lost, 10 could be built. For every plane shot down, factories churned out replacements faster than pilots could be trained. On drafting tables, engineers sketched designs not just for recovery, but for dominance. Faster carriers. Heavier bombers. Planes that could outclimb, outgun, and outlast the vaunted Zero. By late 1942, keels for a new generation of carriers were already taking shape. They were not experimental. They were not few. They were planned in numbers the world had never seen. This was not just production. It was a tsunami. In the cavernous halls of Newport News, hulls stretched longer than football fields, rising like steel skeletons against the sky. Gantry cranes swung massive sections into place. Welding torches traced glowing seams. What once took years was now done in months, even weeks. The Essex-Class was coming, and with it, an armada. The numbers defied imagination. While Japan struggled to patch together a single new carrier, America laid the keels for dozens at once. On average, one Essex-Class carrier was launched every few months. An industrial drumbeat, steady and unrelenting, echoing across the ocean. Workers called it victory fever. Every rivet was personal. Every shift was an act of vengeance for Pearl Harbor. From the smallest factory in Kansas to the great shipyards on the coasts, ordinary Americans became soldiers of steel. And the Japanese noticed. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. American shipyards building faster than Japan could sink. Admirals who once mocked American carriers now whispered about the flood coming their way. Still, in 1942 and 1943, the Essex-Class was only a promise. The Pacific was far from secure. Battles raged at Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, around remote islands whose names few Americans had ever heard. Men died in jungles and seas alike while shipyards back home bent their backs to the task. But the promise was real. With every hull launched, with every deck completed, America's shadow grew larger across the Pacific. Midway had cut Japan. The factories would finish the job. And soon, from those sparks and rivets, a steel leviathan would rise. One that would carry not just planes, but the weight of American vengeance across the ocean. The world had never seen such power before. But it would. Very soon. From the sparks of the shipyards, they emerged. Long, sleek, and immense, the Essex-Class carriers. Each one was a floating city of steel, stretching more than 800 feet from bow to stern. Their flight decks were wide enough to launch squadrons in endless succession, strong enough to absorb the pounding of enemy bombs, flexible enough to carry the war to every corner of the Pacific. These were not fragile toys, as Japan's admirals once sneered. They were leviathans. Beneath their armored decks lay hangars that could swallow nearly 100 aircraft. Hellcats, Avengers, Helldivers, machines of vengeance packed wing to wing. Elevators carried them skyward like thunder rising from the deep. Above, their decks bristled with anti-aircraft guns, gunners waiting to tear apart any enemy daring to strike. Each Essex-Class was powered by engines that churned the ocean into white fury, pushing 40,000 tons of steel across the waves at speeds no battleship could match. Their hulls were armored, compartmentalized, built not just to fight, but to survive. But beyond the numbers, beyond the blueprints, there was something else. A presence. To sailors who first stepped aboard, it felt like walking on the back of a giant. Steel beneath their boots hummed with life. The air carried the smell of oil and paint, the echo of machinery deep below. To them, these ships were more than machines. They were a promise that Pearl Harbor would not be the final chapter, but the opening act of America's return. When the USS Essex was commissioned in December 1942, crowds gathered on the docks. Families waved as the Leviathan slid into the harbor, its fresh paint gleaming in the winter sun. To those watching, it was more than steel. It was a symbol. America had been struck down, humiliated. But now it was rising again, taller, stronger, unstoppable. And Essex was not alone. One by one her sisters followed. Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Lexington, Yorktown, names carved into history, reborn in steel. Each new launch echoed like a drumbeat across the Pacific, the rhythm of an empire awakening. For Japan, the sight of a single Essex on the horizon would soon mean terror. But for America, it meant hope. No longer would its strategy hinge on fragile survivors of Pearl Harbor. No longer would its pilots fly from decks that creaked with age. Now they had a fleet of giants. New, modern, built for the war of tomorrow. The Essex-Class was not just an answer to Japan. It was the hammer that would break their empire. And soon, the hammer would strike. Spring, 1943. The Pacific was still a battlefield of uncertainty. Jungle campaigns dragged on. Japan's navy remained formidable, its pilots still lethal in the skies. But on the horizon, a new silhouette appeared. The first of the Essex-class carriers slipped into war. The USS Essex, her decks bristling with fresh squadrons, cut through the Pacific like a steel predator. She carried a new breed of aircraft, Grumman Hellcats with wings folded like fists, Avengers loaded with torpedoes, Helldivers eager to unleash fury from above. When Essex's engines roared to life, so did America's vengeance. Her first strikes came against Japanese island strongholds. From her deck, wave after wave of aircraft clawed into the sky, engines screaming, their shadows darkening the beaches below. Japanese defenders looked upward in disbelief. Where once a few planes had appeared, now came swarms. Hellcats dove on Zeros with brutal efficiency. The nimble Japanese fighters that once danced circles around American Wildcats found themselves outmatched. Their wings shredded by .50 caliber fire, their cockpits shattered in seconds. The laughter of Japanese aces, once so casual over the radio, gave way to strained calls for help. Bombers followed. Avengers skimmed low, torpedoes slicing into anchored ships. Helldivers screamed from the heavens, their bombs turning airfields into sheets of flame. Ammunition bunkers erupted. Fuel tanks blossomed into fireballs that rolled skyward like burning thunderclouds. The Essex herself was more than a launch platform. She was a fortress. Japanese counterattacks came swift and furious, but her gunners were ready. Dozens of anti-aircraft batteries barked into the sky, stitching the heavens with fire. Kamikaze-like dives came early in desperation, only to be ripped apart before they could strike. For the sailors aboard, the first battles were electric. They had trained, drilled, imagined, but nothing matched the sight of their aircraft returning, wings scarred, smoke trailing, yet victorious. Deck crews scrambled to refuel, rearm, and launch again, turning the giant ship into a machine of relentless rhythm. For Japan, it was the beginning of dread. Reports filtered back. New carriers, larger than any seen before. Squadrons too numerous to count. Pilots more disciplined, more heavily armed. Where once a single American carrier was a rare and fragile sight, now came the Essex, and she was only the first. The mocking words spoken in Tokyo's strategy rooms now rang hollow. This was no toy, no coffin. This was the vanguard of a storm. As Essex prowled the seas, her sisters prepared to join her. Soon there would not be one. There would be many. And each carried the same promise: domination of the Pacific skies. The first blood had been drawn. The rising sun, once unchallenged, now felt the shadow of giants. By 1944, the Pacific had changed. The ocean that once echoed with the cries of victory for Japan now trembled beneath the thunder of a new fleet. Not one Essex. Not two. But an armada, 24 Leviathans, each bristling with steel, fire, and wings. They came in task forces so vast they darkened the horizon. A single Essex-class carried nearly 100 aircraft. Multiply that by 24, and the sky itself seemed American. Squadrons rose in endless succession, clouds of Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers sweeping across islands like storms. To the men aboard, the scale was breathtaking. Launch crews raced across decks, guiding plane after plane into the air until the carriers seemed to breathe, inhale with every recovery, exhale with every launch. Anti-aircraft crews stood watch, their barrels tilting like sentinels at the edge of the world. For Japan, the sight was terrifying. What once required their entire navy to contest, America now achieved with a fraction of its force. Wherever the Essex fleet sailed, it carried airfields larger than entire nations. The swarms struck first at the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian. These islands, once proud outposts of the rising sun, became killing grounds under the shadow of American carriers. Japanese planes rose to meet the invaders, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. Entire formations disappeared in minutes, shredded by disciplined swarms of Hellcats. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became a slaughter. Japanese pilots, some barely trained, hurled themselves into the teeth of American fighter screens. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Zeros and dive bombers fell in a single day. Pilots who had once mocked American skill now radioed their last words into silence, consumed by flames. And still, the swarm pressed forward. Bombers swept Japanese airfields into ruin. Warships that dared approach were gutted by torpedoes and bombs. The Essex-Class had become more than carriers. They were factories of destruction, churning out wave after wave of power until resistance seemed meaningless. To the Japanese commanders, each new report was another blow. 20 carriers sighted. Air groups beyond count. Maps once filled with confident arrows of advance now shrank into desperate circles of defense. Their fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, had been broken, scattered, reduced to fragments. The Essex-Class carried not just planes, but inevitability. To American sailors, it felt as if the ocean itself belonged to them now. Task Force 58 and 38, the great carrier strike groups, roamed where they pleased, striking at will. The sea, once a contested battlefield, had become a highway of vengeance. For Japan, the swarm was a psychological collapse. Admirals who once laughed in smoke-filled rooms now stared at reports with hollow eyes. Pilots spoke of skies that turned black with American planes. Islanders watched as fleets of carriers anchored off their shores, each one a floating city of death. 24 Essex-Class carriers. 24 engines of retribution. The rising sun had mocked America's shipyards. Now, America had answered, not with words, but with steel. And the swarm showed no mercy. By 1945, silence filled the rooms where laughter once echoed. In Tokyo's war councils, the maps were smaller now, their red arrows shrinking into desperate circles of defense. Admirals who once scoffed at America's toy carriers now sat in heavy silence, staring at reports that read like death sentences. Carriers, dozens of them, prowled the seas. Essex-Class ships appeared wherever the rising sun dared to stand. Entire air groups, once the pride of Japan, vanished into smoke and foam. The Zero, once untouchable, fell in burning spirals against squadrons of Hellcats. Battleships, once symbols of strength, sank beneath waves churned by American torpedoes. Some admirals wrote their disbelief in private diaries. Impossible, one scribbled. How can they build so many? Others recorded bitterness, their confidence shattered by the unrelenting tide. What they had dismissed as arrogance now read as tragedy. Those who once raised glasses in smoke-filled rooms now spoke only in whispers. They remembered their mockery. They remembered the jokes about fragile carriers, about America's supposed weakness. And as news arrived of yet another Essex-Class striking their homeland, the laughter seemed like a ghost from another lifetime. On the decks of burning warships, Japanese sailors wept in silence. They fought with bravery, with honor, but against a force that seemed endless. For every carrier sunk, 3 more appeared. For every squadron destroyed, 5 more rose from American decks. The silence grew heavier as the war closed in. Cities burned under American bombers. The fleet was a shadow of its former self. And in the last days, as kamikazes hurled themselves at the Leviathans, even that sacrifice was swallowed by the vastness of the swarm. Admirals who once spoke of destiny now understood defeat. The rising sun had mocked the storm. But the storm had come, vast and merciless. And so they sat in silence, a silence louder than all their boasts. The Essex-Class was more than steel. More than rivets, engines, or squadrons of planes. It was the embodiment of a nation's will. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, from the shock of burning battleships and silent harbors, America had risen. Each Essex-Class carrier was proof that humiliation had not broken the United States, but reforged it. They symbolized resilience. Factories that once stood idle now thundered day and night, transforming raw steel into warships. Men and women who had never seen the ocean now built giants that sailed across it. Every launch, every christening, was not just the completion of a ship, it was the echo of Pearl Harbor answered. They symbolized perseverance. For every sailor lost, new crews stepped aboard. For every carrier struck, 3 more joined the line. Essex-Class ships became living reminders that America did not measure strength in a single battle, but in endurance, in the ability to absorb loss and return stronger. and they symbolized vengeance. Japanese commanders once laughed at the idea of American carriers. But those very carriers now ruled the Pacific, their air groups turning strongholds into ruins, their bombers darkening skies over cities that once seemed untouchable. Sailors aboard the Essex-Class felt it deeply. Walking the vast decks, they carried memories of Pearl Harbor. They knew the names of the ships that burned. They carried the weight of friends lost in the Pacific's early days. And when their squadrons roared into the sky, it was more than duty, it was justice. But the Essex-Class also became something greater than revenge. They embodied a vision of tomorrow. Floating cities that carried democracy, freedom, and determination across an ocean once claimed by empire. Where once Japan's fleet dictated the tides, now America's carriers dictated the future. For families back home, photographs of these giants in newspapers brought hope. Mothers saw sons aboard ships so mighty they seemed invincible. Children traced the outlines of flight decks with wide eyes, dreaming of the day they too would serve. The Essex-Class became a national icon, not just weapons, but reassurance that victory was inevitable. And victory was not just military. It was psychological. The laughter of Japanese admirals had turned to silence. Their fleet was shattered. Their skies were lost. The very sight of Essex-Class carriers off their shores broke morale, reminding them of what they had underestimated. These ships were the story of America itself in World War II. Knocked down, scarred, doubted, but never defeated. Rising, building, overwhelming. They turned despair into dominance. When the war finally began to close, when Japan's cities burned and its navy lay at the bottom of the sea, it was clear, the Essex-Class had been more than tools of war. They were symbols. Of willpower. Of rebirth. Of a nation that refused to bow. And as their decks stretched across the endless Pacific, they carried not only planes and pilots, but the weight of a truth that would echo through history. The Essex-Class was the steel embodiment of America's will to endure. And through them, the Pacific was reclaimed. The Essex-Class did more than win a war. They defined an era. When the guns fell silent in 1945, when Japan signed its surrender beneath the shadow of carriers in Tokyo Bay, the Essex fleet remained. Their decks still smelled of fuel and salt. Their hangars echoed with the ghosts of squadrons that had never returned. They were no longer just weapons, they were monuments. Some continued to serve, carrying jets into the dawn of the Cold War. Others were mothballed, lined in rows like sleeping giants. A few were scrapped, their steel melted down, their legacy reborn in bridges and buildings. And some became museums, silent guardians of memory where veterans walked once more, touching the decks where they had fought, cried, and bled. For the men who served aboard them, the Essex-Class was never just a ship. It was home. It was survival. It was the place where they grew from boys into warriors, where friendships were forged in the roar of engines and the chaos of battle. To them, these carriers carried not only planes but pieces of their souls. And for America, they became a reminder. A reminder of what arrogance underestimates. A reminder of what resolve can build. A reminder that wars are not won by laughter in smoky rooms, but by sacrifice, determination, and the relentless will to rise after falling. In Tokyo, long after the war, Japanese admirals admitted their disbelief. How had America built so many? How had they turned weakness into overwhelming strength? Their pride had blinded them. Their laughter had written their defeat. The Essex-Class stood as proof of that irony. The ships once mocked as toys became the very hammers that shattered an empire. Today, those carriers still live, not all in steel but in memory. In museums where children run their hands along cold railings. In stories told by veterans with trembling voices. In the silence of the ocean, where some of their sisters lie rusting beneath the waves. Their legacy is carved not just in history books, but in the lessons they leave behind, that arrogance builds empires, but humility preserves them. That strength is not measured by the blow you strike, but by the resilience to rise after the blow you take. The Essex-Class was America's answer to Pearl Harbor. They were the storm that followed mockery. The fleet that turned despair into triumph. And though their decks are quiet now, their story still roars, across oceans, across generations, across memory itself. The legacy of the Essex-Class is not only in the steel they carried, but in the will they embodied. A legacy that endures, as vast and unyielding as the Pacific they once ruled.